So, how does each attachment style really feel about the concept of getting back together with an ex? What you'll find is that each attachment style has slightly a different response to this. And we're actually going to talk about the neuroscience of this and what's actually taking place. So, what we're going to talk about is what each attachment style actually feels, what they report about getting back together with an ex, their general overview and viewpoint. And I'm going to save that for the very end of the video because before that, we're going to start by talking about the neuroscience of how breakups actually affect each attachment style. And then we're going to go into the time periods in which each attachment style reports missing their ex the most and feeling the most regretful because there's specific times according to attachment style. And then again, as I said, we'll really save that last piece is the general overview of how each attachment style feels and reports feeling about the idea of getting back together with an ex, whether or not they've even gone through a breakup recently with somebody. Okay, so we'll save that right for the end. Now, if you're new to this channel, I'm excited that you're here. Welcome. My name is Gibson, and I'm the founder of Gibson Integrated Attachment Theory, a proven method that leverages neuroplasticity to actually rewire your attachment style. And after coming up on 14 years of working both with thousands of people in private practice and tens of thousands through our online programs, I am here to share with you the most powerful insights for deep inner healing and transformation from your past, from your childhood, so that you can live your best life. Let's start by talking about a study that represents some of what we're going to dive into here. There was a study done that was all about imagining conflict by Omri Gillith in 2005. So the study specifically took women in relationships and had them scanned in an fMRI while they thought about and tried to stop thinking about relationship scenarios that included conflict, breaking up, and partner loss or death. And what they found based on people's attachment styles was that more attachment anxiety was actually linked to stronger activation in emotional related regions of the brain. So for example, the anterior temporal lobe associated with sadness and less activation in parts of the prefrontal cortex involved in regulating those emotions. So in other words, the more somebody was anxiously attached, the more they struggled. Now, we're going to talk about how everybody thinks about getting back together with their ex in just a minute, I promise, but we have to start here, okay? Then the study went on to take more avoidant individuals and see how they actually responded to thinking about a breakup, conflict, partner death, or loss. And what it found was essentially that more avoidant individuals showed less deactivation in regions like the lateral prefrontal cortex, which showed essentially that their numbing or suppressing strategy works better than that of anxious attachment styles, but it was less efficient than it looks on the surface. And I think this is a really important part to point out, which is that more avoidant individuals, they are really good at being stoic. They're really good at not necessarily showing their emotions, but it does not mean that they are not feeling anything. And research tells us this in all different experiments and data time and time again. If you can think of it this way, it's almost like anxious attachment styles, brains essentially flood when they imagine loss, which helps explain why they're so much more likely to obsess or to ruminate or push to get back together initially, where avoidant attachment styles brains essentially work overtime to keep that pain pushed away. So it may look like they're indifferent about reconciling, but there's a lot more happening under the surface. I just want to let you know, if you are somebody who is grieving a breakup, going through it right now, and want some support, we have a full course called How to Heal from a Breakup. It's the neuroscience of healing from a breakup so much faster because you really get into the roots of why you are grieving and what specifically you're grieving. Things like your needs, things like your traits that you got to express when you were with your ex, and how to bring these things back into your life. There's a few major tools and pillars of how to heal from a breakup in there, but you can check that out fully for free for 7 days. Plus with it, you get access to the needs course for life. So it's actually a free gift that we're giving away on top of this. And learning your own needs and relationship is so important in the relationship to self and to self-soothing with others. So you actually get access to both those courses. One you get to keep free for life, and I'll put the link down below. We just have this for a limited time. So now we're going to get into like what actually each person feels about getting back together. And the most important way to look at this is through the lens of timing. Here's why. The data shows us that different attachment styles feel differently about getting back together with an ex across different time periods. Okay, so we're going to talk about the sweet spot of when this happens for each person, but also the other variables that tend to play into this. We'll start with the anxious attachment style first. When they go through a breakup, they tend to sort of be flooded, like that study was just showing us. When they go through loss, they experience a lot of emotion, a lot of emotional distress. They tend to ruminate and definitely try to push to make things work or to try to get back together. And anxious preoccupied is named that way for a reason, right? They are literally preoccupied with the relationship to the point that a really strong anxious attachment style individual will actually show signs of not even trying to focus on other areas of their lives and show up for things like their career or their friendships or family relationships. Or if they do spend time with friends and family, they will just go and talk about their ex nonstop shortly after a breakup takes place. Okay, this is very common for anxious attachment styles. And in the first few months after a breakup, they generally really want to get back together with their ex. However, this does tend to change ever so slightly over time, and we're going to get into this in just a moment. What you'll see is that anxious attachment styles, they go through a sudden loss or a breakup, and it's very hurtful and painful for them in those initial stages. However, anxious attachment styles are good at getting their needs met in various ways. So although they struggle to meet their own needs for self-soothing, for self-regulation, for self-connection, for self-attunement, because they're so focused and fixated on relationships outside of them, they do end up going and relying on people outside of them, which can be healing and helpful for at least moving them through the healing process post-breakup. Now, don't get me wrong, there are definitely cases with strong anxious attachment styles, especially in longer-term relationships, where they can actually stay in this kind of sympathetic nervous system mode, or it's almost this freeze mode for very long periods of time after a breakup, just ruminating and obsessing about an ex. And those are definitely the exceptions, but the vast majority of anxious attachment styles struggle more initially, but they also have the ability to, over time, process their emotions, regulate through other people, talk a lot about their ex, and eventually they start getting their needs met again by sometimes going back into dating or seeing somebody new. And because they're very adept at asking for their needs from other people, they will be most likely to really want to get back together with an ex in the first 0 to 4 months after a breakup. And you'll generally see that period of time actually minimizes across time in most scenarios. So for example, it's this peak intensity right after a breakup takes place, but after a month, it starts to go down a little bit. And after a month again, you start to see this waning even more. And so that's sort of the anxious attachments experience to a breakup. It's different for both the fearful avoidant and dismissive avoidant. So let's go to the fearful avoidant next. Fearful avoidance, because they have both this sort of anxious and avoidant side to them, they initially actually tend to lean more into their avoidance side after a breakup. A lot of fearful avoidance, the vast majority of the time, will report saying things like, I feel pretty free after a breakup. All the conflict and drama and the roller coaster of the relationship I got to unplug from, and I felt some relief, or I didn't feel like I had to keep pining over this person or putting so much pressure on myself to show up for this person that I wasn't feeling fulfilled by in return, or I wasn't feeling like there was reciprocation taking place. So a lot of fearful avoidance actually end up reporting sort of this initial relief. But fearful avoidance and dismissive avoidance alike have this sort of dynamic I've coined the breakup boomerang effect, because they have this initial relief followed by often long-term actually processing of their feelings a little bit more. And it's different for fearful avoidance and dismissive avoidance separately. Fearful avoidance tend to have the first few weeks where they feel relief. Sometimes this is generally sitting around the first 3 up to 6 weeks of going into their space of like, I'm free. Now, uniquely, fearful avoidance, when they're in this freedom phase, are often also numbing. They're going out more frequently, they're distracting themselves. Sometimes they're drinking or partying or using drugs or substances, because fearful avoidance very much are known for, similar to dismissive avoidance, regulating themselves through creature comforts. They can regulate themselves through other people, but a lot of times they're also regulating themselves through numbing activities rather than actual healthy soothing activities. And so originally, fearful avoidance feel this freedom. They go into all these places. Sometimes they rebound and have these sort of short-lived rebound relationships very quickly, all to really avoid processing their feelings. In doing this, they feel this initial relief and distraction. However, as time goes on, fearful avoidance generally then end up actually retracing their steps and thinking like, wait, was that the right decision? And when that initial sort of high of the freedom and the novelty fades away, which is generally around that 3 to 6 week mark, that is when you will often see fearful avoidance start to wonder about their ex, be curious, sometimes be sad, sometimes even be regretful. Now, I will say this does change based on the length of a relationship. Fearful avoidance who dated somebody for 3 to 6 months are not necessarily going to have this delayed grief period in the same way. But fearful avoidance in the longer term relationships that were usually longer than a year, 2 years, where there was like a decent amount of connection and commitment across time, this is where you're going to see that sort of boomerang of grief where it comes back around. And then generally what we'll see is the fearful avoidants are dealing with this sadness and trying to process their emotions on and off in between stages and cycles of numbing out for quite some time after that 3 to 6 week mark. But specifically in that 3 to 6 week mark is when it is the strongest. And this is sort of the time where they tend to reconsider, reach back out to an ex. But I do want to say here too, just because somebody's reaching out doesn't necessarily mean that they've healed or changed or they're ready to be in a healthy relationship again. And I think that's really important to note sort of on a sidebar there. The last style here is our dismissive avoidant. And generally what we will see for dismissive avoidance is that they tend to feel this freedom and relief moving to that avoidance side. And by the way, please remember that dismissive avoidants are very masterful at repressing and minimizing their attachment needs and kind of stuffing down their emotions. So initially you'll often see that they're like, oh, okay, it wasn't working. Fine. I'm free. I have relief. And for them, they'll usually feel that stage of relief from 6 weeks all the way up to 3 or sometimes even 4 months after a breakup. They have the most delayed grief period more than any other attachment style. And so they'll go through this cycle of going, oh my gosh, I feel free. I feel relieved. And then usually in that 6 week, at the earliest, to somewhere in that 3 to 4 month mark, in that space, that is when they are often reconsidering, did I make the right decision? Was this the right way of showing up and of being in this relationship? They'll often get curious about their ex, sometimes reach out with sort of high level text messages, wanting to sort of drop in and check in, watching all your stories, things like that, where you know that that person clearly has you top of mind because they're interacting with you on social media or they're sending you these high level text messages. But I think that can feel very confusing for people because they're like, okay, what does this mean? Does this high level interaction mean that you actually want to be back together in a relationship? And the answer to that is often no. Sometimes in certain cases it's a yes, but if you're thinking of re-engaging with an ex, you should be seeing that they're actually doing the work. They're fully initiating. They're like, hey, I made a mistake. Let's go on a date. Let's catch up. Let's work through things. I'm working on myself. Like you need to see, I always tell people, look for the red to green flag imbalance. If somebody's, got a little green flag that's teeny tiny because they're reaching out indirectly, okay, that's great. But like if they're all red flags because you broke up and it wasn't working, you're really imbalanced. The red flags are really carrying the weight here. On the other hand, if somebody comes back to you and they're like, hey, I miss you. I'm thinking of you. I want to talk to you. They talk to you in person. They're like, I've been doing this work. I'm working on myself. I'm growing. Here's what I'm accountable for. I realize where I messed up in the relationship. I want to do this better. Are you willing to do the work with me? Like if somebody's showing up with all of these green flags like that, well, then maybe you do reconsider being with them, right? That's enough to say, hey, take it slow, go on a date, see what happens, see if their actions actually match their words that they're saying. Like that, we're really looking for that more than anything. I think that's so important to say that just because somebody's missing you and wants to get back together with you as their ex and is thinking about it and feeling a certain way or fantasizing about it doesn't necessarily equate to doing the work. So those are generally the things that you'll see. And the last thing is at a high level, anxious attachment styles report feeling open and interested in getting back together with their exes. They literally say that before they're even having an ex. Like that's their general standpoint. Fearful avoidants are generally kind of hot and cold about it. They say, no, I think when it's done, it should probably be done, but I have done it. I have been back together with exes before. And dismissive avoidants are generally the most wary about it. They'll be like, I don't think that's a good idea. If something doesn't work, why would you ever try again? And yet dismissive avoidants often do go back to exes in specific situations. So I hope this gave you a lot of information and was supportive and helpful for you today. Thank you so much for watching. If you don't want to miss any of our daily content and our giveaways that we do very frequently on this channel, make sure you subscribe and hit that notification bell so you don't miss anything. And we'll see you soon.